She came to stay for 3 days. She stayed for 30 years, and when the people of Deep Creek, Oregon tell this story, and they do tell it, believe me, because in a small town, a story like this gets carved into the collective memory like initials on a pine trunk. They always reach the exact same point and pause for a moment, as if they needed to catch their breath for what comes next. Everyone knew the reason why she had stayed. The entire town knew, except for him. Have you ever loved someone in silence for so long that the love became part of the air you breathe, and you don't even realize you are breathing it anymore? Imagine then carrying that for 30 whole years without a single spoken word, without a single gesture that crossed the border between what is felt and what is said, and only on the eve of parting, when everything seemed lost forever, the truth finally decided to show itself. It is exactly this kind of story that breaks the heart the most. And it is exactly this kind of story that unites people the most, because who hasn't hesitated at the wrong moment? Who hasn't kept a word inside that should have been spoken much sooner? This happened in April 1922 in a small town called Deep Creek, nestled deep in rural Oregon, where the great flat-topped pines grow so tall they seem to hold up the sky, where the winter bites with a vengeance. And the rich dark soil keeps stories the way mud keeps footprints. If you are just arriving here at the Tales of Yesteryear channel, a very warm welcome to you. Tell me here in the comments where you are watching from which city, from which state in the US, or perhaps from another country, as more and more people watch us from afar. I love knowing where you all are. And if you already know the channel, thank you for being here once again. Now come with me, because this story deserves your full attention from beginning to end. Eleanor Fitzgerald was 28 years old and carried a worn brown leather suitcase that had already made more trips than she cared to count. It was a suitcase that knew trains and stagecoaches and dirt roads, and which carried on that afternoon in April 1922 clothes for 3 days, a few books she never traveled without, a notebook, and the quiet weight of a woman who had refused the life everyone expected of her and was still trying to figure out what life she wanted in return. Eleanor was a certified teacher, having graduated from the Portland Normal School. She was the daughter of a civil servant who believed, with the conviction of simple men who are sometimes right, that education was the only inheritance that could not be confiscated by anyone, not by time, not by circumstances, not by powerful men who sometimes took everything else. Her mother, Abigail, thought her daughter's education had gone a bit too far, not because it was a bad thing, but because it had pushed Eleanor away from certain choices that seemed, to her, as obvious as the sunrise. The main one was her engagement to Henry Aldridge. Henry was a good man. Eleanor was always fair enough to admit that, even in the moments when the memory still arrived with a slight sting. He was attentive, softly spoken, worked at a respectable bank in downtown Portland, always had his hair neatly combed, and had a plan for life that included, in this strict and well-calibrated order, a house in the West Hills neighborhood, a rose garden he would tend to on Sundays, and a wife who enjoyed embroidering and hosting visitors in the late afternoons. There was absolutely nothing wrong with this plan. It was an honest and gentle plan, the kind that many people would have accepted with boundless gratitude. The problem was that Eleanor had realized on a Thursday afternoon in May 1920, while standing in a shop choosing the fabric for her wedding dress, that she could not see herself inside that plan. She stood with the fabric in her hands, looking out the window at the street, and felt with all possible clarity that such a life, however good it might be, was not her life. It was a clarity that did not stem from anger or coldness. It came from somewhere deeper, from the kind of knowing that the body recognizes before the mind can find the words for it. She returned the ring the following Friday. Henry didn't understand. Her mother didn't understand, and spent a good month refusing to speak to her. Her father sighed and said he trusted her judgment, but that he would pray she knew what she was doing. Eleanor said she would pray for that too. It wasn't certainty that she had, it was merely that quiet firmness of someone who doesn't know where they are going, but knows it isn't there. The answer arrived on a grey day in October 1921, in the form of a letter from a law office in Eugene. Her aunt Prudence Fitzgerald had passed away. She left her niece Eleanor a property in the township of Deep Creek, a wooden house with a wraparound porch, a plot of land with pines and woods in the back, and a vegetable garden that, the attorney warned with the dryness typical of legal documents, had probably grown entirely wild. Eleanor had never visited her aunt in that place. Prudence was her father's unmarried sister, the one who had left Portland decades earlier and settled in rural Oregon because, as she wrote in the letters she sent once a year, always on blue stationery, always with handwriting slanted to the right as if the words were in a hurry to reach the end before the ink ran out. The country had more silence, and silence made more noise than people thought. The attorney said there were papers to sign, an inspection to perform, some legal procedures. He estimated 3 days to sort it all out, 4 at the most. 3 days. Eleanor bought a train ticket to Eugene. In Eugene, she secured a spot on a wagon that traveled to Deep Creek once a week, carrying provisions and mail. She packed her suitcase, thinking of 3 days. She informed the principal of the school where she taught that she would be away for a week, just to have a margin, because Eleanor was the kind of person who always calculated a margin. She felt life was safer that way. What she hadn't calculated was what she would find on the other side of that journey. The wagon departed Eugene on a crisp April morning. The driver was a man named Ben, of few words and great skill with horses, who smoked a corncob pipe non-stop throughout the route, and answered Eleanor's questions about Deep Creek with the frugality of someone who sees no point in spoiling a surprise. He said it was a good town. He said the folks were hard-working. He said the winter there chilled you to the bone. Regarding any other detail, he simply shrugged with an expression that suggested the town would speak for itself. The landscape shifted along the way in a manner that held Eleanor's attention for the hours of travel. First came the open fields and the wide sky of the Eugene area, possessing that quality of an endless horizon that makes the head feel small, but the chest feel vast. Then slowly the great pines began to appear, first one, then two, then clusters, then entire groves, those monumental trees with sweeping horizontal branches that looked like umbrellas from a Japanese painting, with limbs jutting out at all angles in the upper third of the smooth, dark trunk. Eleanor had not seen those trees up close often enough to have normalized them. Every time she saw them, there was something about them that made her want to stop and just stare. The smell arrived before the town did. It was pine resin warmed by the afternoon sun, a clean and slightly sharp scent that seemed to brush the inside of the nose and leave the air with a newfound transparency. Then came the smell of earth wet from recent rain, that dark Oregon soil which on damp afternoons takes on almost the color of dark rust, a color that seems more vividly alive than any dirt has the right to be. Deep Creek appeared around the bend in the road with the humility of towns that grew to solve concrete problems, not to impress anyone. Wide, dirt roads lined with wooden houses of varying ages and states of repair, tin roofs and cedar shingles, wooden gates, small front yards with the first flowers of autumn. A town square in the center with a bandstand painted a faded green, the little stone church with a single tower where the bell marked the hours. The butcher shop, the pharmacy, the bakery, and on the corner of the main street and the road leading down toward the creek, Simpson's General Store. The store had a wooden facade painted a yellow that time had muted into the color of old straw. Above the double doors, in black letters that someone had painted with great care and the sun had worn away with indifference, it read, Simpson's General Store, Dry Goods and Hardware, since 1903. The door stood open. From inside wafted a mixed scent of roasted coffee, kerosene, lye soap, and aged wood. the specific smell of country general stores that Eleanor had encountered before in other places, but which here carried an intensity and wholeness that made it unmistakable. Ben halted the wagon out front and said the best place to ask for directions was right through that door, that Mr. Arthur knew every inch of the town. Eleanor stepped down from the wagon, straightened her hat, which the journey had knocked slightly askew, grabbed her suitcase, and walked in. The store was long with high ceilings, featuring shelves on both sides laden with goods, organized by a method that wasn't obvious at first glance, but certainly existed. There were tins of provisions, spools of thread, sacks of flour, tools hanging from hooks, a kerosene barrel near the back wall. The wooden floorboards had been swept clean. Upon the long, dark wood counter rested an open ledger, an inkwell, a steaming mug of black coffee, and a man. The man behind the counter had a shoulder width that seemed somewhat excessive for the space, not in an unpleasant way, but in the way certain things possess a presence that the surrounding environment needs a moment to absorb. He had dark hair with the first hints of grey starting at the temples, a face weathered by an outdoor life, and large hands with knuckles marked by hard work. At that moment, those hands were noting something in the ledger in a small, meticulous script that surprised Eleanor. She didn't know why she had expected something else, but she had. He lifted his eyes when she walked in. His eyes were deep brown, holding that quality of calm attention some people possess, which others mistake for coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was the exact opposite of coldness. It was the kind of attention that listens before it speaks, that observes before it concludes, that has the patience to let things show what they are before deciding what they are. It was the attention of people who don't need to fill the silence because they are entirely comfortable within it. Eleanor said good afternoon. She explained that she was Prudence Fitzgerald's niece and had arrived to settle the inheritance. She asked where the property was located. He remained quiet for a moment that was exactly a moment. Not too long, not too short. Then he said he did know it. Yes, that it was the house with the wraparound porch at the end of Monument Street, and that Miss Prudence had passed away 3 months ago. He said this with the tone of someone stating a fact while simultaneously giving it the proper weight, neither exaggerated nor dry. He said it was a shame that Miss Prudence had been a fine woman. He said the way there was simple. Step out of the store, turn left, walk up to the stone memorial in the center of the street, and then keep straight until the second house with a big leaf maple out front. He said all this in short, unadorned sentences, without asking the questions most people would ask: where she came from, how long she was staying, what she intended to do with the property. None of those questions. Then he glanced at her leather suitcase and asked if she was arriving alone. Eleanor said yes. He nodded, as if that was sufficient information for everything he needed to process. He returned to his ledger. She turned to leave. Then she heard behind her, without having asked anything at all, the man's voice state that the key to the house was with Mrs. Zimmerman, the second house on the right before the memorial, and that the water hand pump in the yard sometimes stuck, but a firm strike on the right side usually solved it. Eleanor paused. She turned her face over her shoulder. He had gone back to his ledger. He kept writing with the same applied concentration as before, as if he hadn't said anything special at all. She walked out of the store carrying her suitcase, unable to explain to herself why that detail, the strike on the right side of the water pump, had seemed so strangely kind. It was practical information, nothing more. It was the sort of thing one person tells another when they have the data and realize it might be useful. And yet, there was a quality of attention in it that she hadn't expected from a stranger. It was the first day. Prudence's house smelled of stagnant time. It was the scent of places shut tight for months, a blend of dry wood, suspended dust, and the very faint ghost of some herb that had grown in the garden, leaving its mark in the air like a lingering signature. Eleanor opened the windows one by one, from the main parlor to the kitchen, letting in the late Oregon afternoon with its slightly grayish blue, and its chill that arrived unhurriedly but with sheer determination. The house was simple, of honest construction: wooden walls, plank floors, a ceiling just high enough not to feel heavy. There were blue cotton curtains on the windows, a blue that had faded to a shade which was, in truth, prettier than the original. A well-loved sky blue. In the kitchen, a heavy cast-iron stove anchored the corner, a dark wood table with 4 straight-back chairs, a bookshelf that Eleanor walked straight toward because Eleanor always walked straight toward bookshelves, and where she recognized titles Prudence had mentioned in her letters: Thomas Hardy, an old dictionary, a Bible with a worn spine, a few books of folk remedies that her aunt consulted with the mixture of skepticism and hope that practical women have toward folk medicine. On the porch, there were 2 low wooden benches, angled slightly toward each other, as if they had been positioned for a conversation that was interrupted one day, and the benches were still waiting for it to resume. From the backyard, the view was entirely of pines. 3 massive Douglas firs, with dark, sweeping canopies that looked painted across the sky with a broad, confident brush, flanked by younger pines growing down toward the valley. The sun was setting behind them, and the light was golden and slanted, the kind that makes things seem more important than they are, or perhaps the kind that reveals the importance things already hold, but which overly direct light conceals. Eleanor stood at the edge of the yard staring at those pines for a length of time she couldn't pinpoint later. Then she went inside, found Mrs. Zimmerman, a tiny older woman with bright eyes and a hospitable tongue, who handed over the key along with a jar of apple butter and 15 minutes of history about Prudence, about the town, about the good folks who lived there and the other sorts who also lived there, just like anywhere else. Eleanor listened to it all with the same attention she gave to any conversation, which was genuine attention, because Eleanor had discovered early on that people always say more than they intend when they feel truly heard. Back at the house, she boiled water on the cast-iron stove, which accepted the fire with a solidity that seemed in that moment a rare virtue. She made tea. She struck the water pump exactly where the man from the store had told her. The water poured out clean, cold, and in good volume. That night Eleanor slept in Deep Creek for the first time, with the Oregon cold creeping in under the door and the pines making that soft, continuous sound in the wind, like the breathing of something much larger than herself. It was the second day. In the morning, she went to the attorney's office, situated in a brick building near the square. The attorney, Mr. Farnsworth, a middle-aged man with a spine curved by the accumulated weight of all the documents he had drafted, which were many, explained that the process would take a few days longer than anticipated, because there was an old annotation on one of the property records that needed to be clarified with the county office in Eugene. A week, maybe 10 days, he estimated, studying the papers with that expression of mild embarrassment common to people who bear bad news but prefer to wrap it up in technical jargon. Eleanor said she understood. She walked back to Prudence's house. With time to kill and the innate nature of someone who observes carefully, she went walking through the town. It was a little over 2 hours of peaceful exploration, down wide dirt roads that smelled of past rain and wood smoke. There was a one-room schoolhouse, run by a teacher who taught all ages together with the resources he had, which were whatever he had. There was a doctor who took appointments 2 days a week, traveling from Eugene. There was Mr. O'Malley's pharmacy, who also acted as a dentist when necessary, and who kept a stock of medicines and a face that looked like it had seen it all. There was Mrs. Ellis's bakery, Cornelius's butcher shop, the general store. Mid-morning, passing down a street that ran behind the square, Eleanor heard the sound of shingles being shifted. She looked up. At the peak of a small house, its wood darkened by time and years of Oregon rain, a man was on the roof. He was examining the cedar shingles with the methodical care of someone who knows exactly what he's doing, lifting each one, checking the structure underneath, replacing or discarding depending on the condition. There was no rush. There was only attention. Eleanor recognized the shoulders. It was the man from the general store. She leaned lightly against a post on the other side of the street and just watched. There was something hypnotic about that labor, in the care with which he did a thing that most people would have done faster and with less focus. Then she approached a woman walking by and asked quietly whose house it was. The woman glanced at the roof and said it belonged to Mrs. Cecilia, a widow of many years who lived there on the means she had, which were not many. Eleanor asked if the man on the roof was a relative of hers. The woman gave a small chuckle and said, "No, that was Mr. Arthur Simpson from the store." She said that whenever someone in town needed something and couldn't afford to pay, Arthur would show up. No one knew how he found out. People in need didn't usually broadcast it. It was exactly the sort of thing folks hide. And yet, he appeared. The woman said this with the specific tone of someone describing something she accepts as part of the local scenery, but knows is entirely uncommon. Eleanor stood looking at that figure on the roof for a moment, much longer than any practical purpose required. Then she continued on her way. Later, swinging by the store to buy sugar and flour she had noticed were missing from Prudence's pantry, she found him back behind the counter as if he had never left. There was lingering cedar dust between the fingers of his large hands, but his apron was clean and the ledger was open in its usual spot. She bought what she needed. He weighed it, wrote it down, wrapped each item in brown butcher paper and twine, kept at the edge of the counter, displaying the quiet competence of people who have done the same thing so many times. It has become a natural extension of the body. As she was placing the parcel into her bag, he mentioned, without looking at her, that the coffee was ready. He said he usually had a cup around 10 in the morning and had poured enough for 2 out of habit, which sometimes happened. Eleanor looked at the pot on the wooden counter. It was a sturdy enamel percolator, and steam still rose softly from the spout. She looked at him. He finally raised his eyes from the counter. There was something in his expression that wasn't exactly an invitation, but wasn't indifference either. It was an open space, the kind of space some people open up, leaving the other person to decide whether or not to step in, with no pressure in either direction. She stepped in. She leaned against the counter holding a thick ceramic mug, feeling the heat of the brew through the clay and that slightly bitter, dark roasted taste she had learned to love ever since she first had black coffee at a school friend's house. They talked about the town. He answered her questions with the same economy of words, but there was a precision in his answers that she appreciated, the precision of someone who knows the subject well and doesn't need to invent anything. They talked about the pines, about the condition of the road, about the kind of winter Oregon had in that region. He said it was a winter that built character, which Eleanor thought was a curiously perfect description. He asked if she had found everything in order at Prudence's house. She said yes, that there were a few things to tend to, but nothing serious. She added that the water pump had worked perfectly with the strike he had mentioned. He said that was good. He went back to looking at the ledger. 15 minutes. It wasn't 15 minutes of intense conversation or grand revelations. It was 15 minutes of black coffee and quiet talk with a stranger who had proven himself in 2 days, more observant than most people she had met in years. Eleanor said thank you and left the store with her shopping bag and with something that didn't yet have a name, but was undeniably real. A feeling of having touched the surface of something that, possessed far more depth than it showed. It was on that second day that it happened, the thing she would later describe to herself, simply as the moment she realized the bottom was much deeper than her eyes had calculated. It was the 3rd day. Eleanor woke up before the sun, with the grey Oregon cold slipping in under the door and the valley fog making the great pines look like pencil sketches on damp paper. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time with a cup of tea in her hands, watching that landscape of mist and pine being slowly dissolved by the morning sun, layer by layer, like someone carefully opening a letter. Her suitcase was packed on the bed. Ben, the driver, would pass by at 10 in the morning to take her back to Eugene, where she would catch the train back to Portland. Eleanor drank her tea slowly. She thought of Portland, of the rented apartment with white walls and a window facing another white wall, which she had tried to liven up with a plant that died in the second week from lack of sufficient sun, of the school where she taught, with the rowdy classes and the principal who believed female teachers should stick to the early grades and leave advanced schooling to their male colleagues, an opinion he expressed with a subtlety that made it impossible to confront directly. She thought of Henry, who had likely found another woman willing to live in the West Hills and embroider on Sundays, which was fine. He deserved someone who actually wanted that. She thought of her mother, who had spent the month after the broken engagement giving her the silent treatment, and who now spoke to her normally, but with the tone of someone who had swallowed something they couldn't fully digest. She thought of a man on a widow's roof in the biting April cold of Oregon that wasn't anyone's obligation, fixing shingles that weren't his, which he hadn't promised anyone he would fix. At 8 minutes to 10 in the morning, she checked her watch later, trying to pinpoint the exact instant of the decision, that instant when a life folds and goes one way instead of another. Eleanor placed the empty cup on the iron stove, walked into the bedroom, took the suitcase off the bed, and began to unpack it. When Ben stopped the wagon in front of the gate at 10 sharp, smoking his pipe and shaking the reins with the patience of someone who waits for things without knowing exactly what, Eleanor walked up to him and told him she had changed her plans, that she would be staying a few more days, that when she needed transport she would send word through Mr. Daniels from the school. Ben nodded, taking the pipe out of his mouth for a second, as if the gesture were the equivalent of a nod. He said, "All right, that's how it goes. Just send word when you need it." He clicked his tongue at the horses and drove away. She went back inside Prudence's house. She didn't know then that it wouldn't be a few more days. She didn't know it would be 30 years. But there was something, deep down in that quiet place she had discovered the day before, that wasn't surprised by the decision. It was as if that place inside knew before her head did, and was just waiting for her mind to catch up. The 4th day passed. The 5th. The week turned into a month before she realized she had stopped counting the days. It was the first time in Eleanor's life that she had lost the thread of account. She was the kind of person who counted everything: calendar days, pages in a book, stairs, cups of tea drank during a rainy afternoon. When she realized she had stopped, she spent a long moment thinking about what that meant. She concluded it meant she was home. The decision to stay officially, when it came, had the bureaucratic quality of decisions that have already been made internally and merely require paperwork to be recognized by the world. She wrote to the school principal in Portland, saying she would not be returning to her position, thanking him for the years and wishing them well. She wrote to her mother, saying she had inherited a property and intended to use it, that she was fine, that there was no cause for worry. She wrote to Mr. Farnsworth, the attorney, saying she didn't want to sell, that she wanted to register the deed in her name permanently. Mr. Farnsworth took a week to recover from the surprise and processed all the documents with moderate efficiency. Prudence's house became Eleanor's house. She cleaned it from top to bottom in a solitary community raising that lasted 3 days straight. She shook out the faded blue curtains and decided to keep them, deciding that the worn blue was far prettier than any new blue she could hang. She polished the floorboards with carnauba wax she bought at the store. She reorganized the books on the shelf. She planted tomatoes next to what remained of Prudence's vegetable patch, and some chamomile seedlings she bought at the market from a woman who came from one of the outlying farms. She gave the porch and the 2 wooden benches the conversation they had been waiting for. She sat on both at different times of the day to figure out which caught more morning sun and which got a better afternoon breeze. It was in the second week that Bea appeared. Beatrice Carter, whom everyone called Bea, was the laundress, and she had serviced half the houses on Monument Street long enough to know the habits, secrets, and untold stories of every single family. She was 42, with arms that displayed decades of labor with a washboard and basin, and graying hair pinned up in a bun that never sat exactly in the center of her head, but also never managed to fall out. Her eyes belonged to someone who registers everything, keeps what needs keeping, and shares what she feels needs sharing, based on a personal criteria she didn't explain, but which the people around her had learned to respect. Bea showed up at the front door early one Saturday with a basket over her arm, saying she'd heard Miss Prudence's niece had come to stay and was dropping by to introduce herself and ask if the young lady needed a laundress. Eleanor said she did. Bea said she could count on her. They sat on the porch with tea and a slice of Mrs. Zimmerman's apple butter, and within 40 minutes of conversation, Bea had provided the background history of 70% of the town's residents, including information that was likely not public knowledge, but which she shared with the generosity of someone who considers hoarded information to be wasted information. She spoke of Mr. Farnsworth and his perpetually slower than necessary legal processes. She spoke of Mr. O'Malley the pharmacist, who was a magnificent fiddle player at the town dances. She spoke of Mayor Sullivan, who agreed with everything and accomplished little. She spoke of the folks on the street, the families in the countryside, the town festivals. She did not speak of Arthur Simpson, at least not that day. Eleanor noticed the absence and said nothing. She had learned early on that the information someone chooses not to give is sometimes more revealing than what they do. As she was leaving, Bea paused at the gate and looked at Eleanor with a frank, appraising expression that lasted a second longer than politeness would permit in other contexts, but which in that context simply felt honest. Then she said she thought it was a good thing the young lady had stayed. That Deep Creek was in need of new folks, the right kind of new folks. Eleanor stood at the gate after Bea turned the corner, looking at the empty street and the pines in the background, and thought that there was something in this town she hadn't yet been able to fully name, but which fit into a place inside her that had been empty for far too long. The idea for the school came 3 weeks later. Eleanor had visited the classroom operating behind Town Hall, a wooden structure with small windows that let in little light and entirely too much wind through the cracks. Mr. Daniels, a man of about 35 who had gotten his degree by correspondence and was dedicated within the limits of what he knew, tended to nearly 40 students of all ages in a single room, with a single set of materials, his voice needing to carry all the way to the back with no support whatsoever. She spent a whole afternoon there, sitting in the corner observing, and left with a head full of possibilities, and the absolute certainty that there was room to do much more. She went to Mayor Sullivan. He received her with that smile of someone about to agree with everything without committing to anything concrete. Eleanor explained her background, her experience, the need to expand the school. The mayor said it was an excellent idea, that it was exactly the kind of initiative the township needed, that he would see what he could do, that there were some budgetary matters he needed to check with the board. Eleanor walked out of Town Hall, went to the general store to buy writing paper, and started writing. To the State Board of Education, to teachers' associations in Portland, to school supply vendors in Eugene, to anyone or any entity that might entertain a concrete proposal. She didn't know she was already being heard much closer to home. 3 weeks later, returning from an afternoon at the attorney's office settling supplementary inheritance papers, she found stacks of sawn lumber piled in the empty lot next to Town Hall, the very lot the mayor had vaguely mentioned as a possible site for a school. The wood was good, dry, the right kind for civil construction. There was no invoice, no sender, no explanation. She asked the mayor, He said with genuine surprise that he had no idea where it had come from. She asked the town lumberman, a man named Albert, who operated the sawmill 2 miles outside of town. Albert studied the dirt floor with a level of attention the dirt did not merit, stated it had already been paid for, and said he couldn't say any more. Eleanor went back to the store. She waited for a moment when the other customers had left. Then she told Arthur that there was lumber on the town hall lot and that someone had paid for it and asked to remain anonymous. He kept his eyes on the ledger. She stood waiting. He said the town needed a school. He said this to the ledger in a voice that was completely neutral, the kind that isn't claiming guilt but isn't denying it either. She said yes, it did. She said someone had understood that before the mayor had. He said sometimes that's how it goes. She looked at him for a moment, then she said thank you, not for the lumberman, not for the lot, but for the understanding. He nodded. She left. 6 months later, B confirmed what Eleanor had already deduced. The lumber had come out of Arthur's pocket, bought without an announcement, and delivered without credit. B mentioned this in passing, the way one mentions the weather, and then steered the conversation down another path, and Eleanor let her because some things remain more whole when they aren't over-analyzed. The school was built in a community raising during a week in September. The men of the town took shifts in the afternoons after work, and on one full Saturday they did the bulk of the construction. Eleanor worked alongside everyone. She served water and coffee, handed out tools, took notes, and organized the workflow when the raising got disorganized. Arthur was among those working. There were at least 12 men in total, all moving around the same project, and yet she was aware of exactly where he was throughout the day with a precision she hadn't asked to possess. At the end of Saturday, when the walls were up and the roof was shingled and the smell of fresh-cut cedar hung in the air with that distinct quality of a new beginning, Eleanor walked over to where he was putting away his tools. She told him she knew what he had done. She said there were no proper words to thank him. He closed his toolbox slowly. He said the town needed a good school, and that was that. She said it was more than that. She said it was an act of faith in the place, believing that something good would grow in a spot before it even existed. She said this with that direct attention she had, which sometimes unsettled people, because it wasn't common for someone to say exactly what they were thinking. He stayed quiet for a second. Then he said good night, Eleanor, and walked away with the low October sun on his back and the toolbox in his hand. She stood watching that figure walk away into the red light of the late afternoon and thought, for the second time, but this time with words, that there was something about that man that was impossible not to notice. It wasn't handsomeness, it wasn't prestige. It was that much rarer quality that manifests in the way someone acts when they have no obligation to act whatsoever. The school opened in March 1923. 2 rooms, 48 students divided by learning levels, Mr. Daniels in one and Eleanor in the other. It was modest, it was imperfect in 20 different ways, and it was exactly what the town needed. On opening day, after the families had gone home and the square grew quiet, and Eleanor was left alone in the new classroom straightening the desks out of habit, she heard footsteps at the door. It was Arthur, holding a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a Webster's dictionary, a hardcover notebook, and a box of chalk. He said he figured it might be useful for a start. Eleanor looked at the gift. She looked at him. She said it was perfect. He said good. He turned around and walked away. The dictionary remained on her desk for the next 30 years. Time in Deep Creek had a completely different texture than time in Portland. In Portland, time was marked by appointments and streetcars and wall clocks in buildings that reminded the world every hour that it was passing. In Deep Creek, time was marked by the seasons, and Oregon has seasons that ask for neither permission nor forgiveness. Winter arrived with a vengeance. It transformed the valley into a greyish blue that took Eleanor a few weeks to stop finding bleak and start finding absolutely beautiful. A cold, honest beauty that wasn't trying to impress anyone. Frost painted the garden herbs white overnight, and the morning sun slowly dissolved it like sugar in warm water. The great pines weathered it all with that dark green impassiveness that felt less like a botanical trait and more like a philosophical stance acquired over centuries of existence. Autumn meant wind, yellow leaves, and the smell of hot coffee wafting from every house simultaneously, as if the whole town had agreed to head indoors at the exact same hour. Spring was a fine, persistent drizzle and dark volcanic soil that stained the hems of skirts, a colour that never entirely washed out. Eleanor learned to accept this as the inevitable toll of living in a place that truly exists. Summer was short, intense, with a heat that surprised anyone who thought the Northwest was always cold, smelling of wild chamomile growing on the edges of paths and heated pine resin that hung in the air, in a way Eleanor categorized as one of the best smells she had ever encountered. She learned the seasons of Deep Creek, as if learning the language of a place. First the grammar, then the syntax, until the day came when she stopped translating and started thinking directly in that language. Tuesdays became the axis of the week without anyone having planned it. It happened the way the best things happen, without conscious decision, without agreement, merely through the silent accumulation of coincidences that repeat until they become habit, and the habit becomes necessity, and the necessity becomes part of the invisible structure holding the days up. Every Tuesday, Eleanor went to the store to do her weekly shopping. And every Tuesday when she walked in, there was a steaming mug of black coffee on the counter, already poured, the ceramic still hot to the touch. She never had to ask. He never asked if she wanted it. It was like a phrase they both knew by heart and recited without needing to remember they were reciting it. They talked about everything and nothing, with that specific blend of topics that people who understand each other well share, about what had happened in town during the week, about the book one or the other was reading. He read more than people expected of a country storekeeper. He had 6 feet of well-kept, well-read books on his shelves at home, and he offered opinions on them with a precision that didn't aim to impress, but came from someone who had genuinely paid attention. She had stopped being surprised by this the first time he accurately critiqued the structure of a Thomas Hardy novel that they had both read by coincidence in the same fortnight. Eventually, she stopped being surprised by anything he said, because she had realized that whatever he said always came from a genuine place. They talked about the weather, about the road being improved, about some issue at the school he had sometimes heard about before she even arrived, because the store was the hub of all information networks in Deep Creek. Everyone passed through, everyone talked a little, and a quiet man who listens carefully hoards more information than any loud person asking direct questions. They talked about everything. They never talked about what lay beneath all of it. In the winter of 1923, she went to the store on a Monday. It wasn't her day, but the kerosene for her lamp had run out, and she needed light to grade her students' papers that night. She bought the kerosene, went back home. When she reached her front gate, there was a stack of pine firewood sitting outside her door. Not just any wood, dry wood, the kind that catches easily and holds a fire, chopped to the exact sizes that fit her kitchen stove. She hadn't asked. She hadn't mentioned at the store that her firewood was running low. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. The next day, swinging by the store, she said she had found firewood at her door and wanted to know who to thank. He said B had mentioned she was running short. Eleanor looked at him. B came on Fridays, lived on the other side of town, and had no reason to know the state of her firewood. The previous Friday had been sunny and unseasonably warm for winter, and B hadn't even needed to step into the kitchen. Eleanor calculated all of this in an instant, but she didn't say anything. She merely said, "Thank you." 2 weeks later, while organizing the drawer where she kept her school supplies, she found a scrap of brown butcher paper nestled among the documents with a single line of text. It was the return note for a book she had lent him, a collection of essays she had left on the store counter, saying she thought he'd enjoy it. He had returned it the following Tuesday without comment, and she had placed the book back on the shelf and forgotten about the slip of paper. The note read, "Good, the ending surprised me." 5 words. A blank line after them, as if there were more to write and someone had decided no, 5 words was enough, or it was the maximum, or both things at the same time. Eleanor folded the note in half and placed it in the back of the drawer. It stayed there for the next 30 years. June of 1925 brought the liveliest summer jubilee that Deep Creek had seen in years. The square was decorated with colorful tissue paper pennants that the Oregon wind tried to snatch away several times, and which the women of the committee patiently and stubbornly pinned back up. A massive bonfire was built in the center, artfully constructed by 3 men who spent the entire afternoon on it. Mr. O'Malley, the pharmacist, who was, as Bea had claimed, the best fiddle player in town, played for 4 hours straight, pausing only for the brief respite of a glass of water, and people danced in the golden dust of the square with that joy of a country fair that mixes the genuine and the performative in a way that's impossible to untangle, and which, deep down, is just pure joy. Eleanor danced. She had a natural lightness on her feet and a rhythm that surprised anyone who didn't expect it from her. She danced with Mr. Daniels, who was eager but stiff. She danced with the visiting doctor who had stayed for the festival. She danced with Bea's brother, who was visiting for a few days, and was by far the best dance partner at the Jubilee, leading with grace and perfect timing. Arthur leaned against the doorframe of the general store, which he had kept open for anyone wanting water or coffee. It was a known fact that he didn't dance. No one had ever managed to pull Arthur out for a dance at a Jubilee, and the townsfolk had accepted this as part of his definition, like the fact that he opened at 6 in the morning and that the store's coffee was the best in town. He stood there for the duration of the Jubilee holding a mug, chatting with passers-by, watching the party with that calm, unhurried attention that was the hallmark of his way of moving through the world. Eleanor caught his eye once, from the makeshift dance floor in the middle of the square, lifting her gaze toward him. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second, no more, no less, and then he lowered his gaze back to his mug and she returned to the rhythm of the dance, and neither of them did anything with that second. When the bonfire burned low, and most folks had gone home, and the square grew quiet with the remnants of the party, crumpled pennants, bonfire ash, the smell of wood smoke and kicked-up dirt, which, blended together, is the smell of a party winding down. Eleanor went to retrieve her purse, which she had left on the store counter so she wouldn't have to carry it while dancing. Her hair had escaped its pins, and she was tucking it back up as she walked, feeling that good kind of exhaustion of someone who has moved and laughed and spent exactly the right kind of energy. Arthur appeared beside her as she crossed the square toward Monument Street. He said it was dark, and he was heading that way anyway. Eleanor looked at him. There were 3 street lamps still lit in the square, and the moon hung in a mostly clear sky. It wasn't that dark, but she said, of course, company was welcome. They walked in silence for the 2 blocks that separated the square from her house. The silence between them was already, even then, its own distinct entity, not a lack of topics, not discomfort, but a state in which both seemed equally at ease. Like 2 musicians who can rest their instruments without the silence feeling like a mistake. At the front door of her house, under the big-leaf maple that cast a shadow even at night, she thanked him for the company. He said good night. She went inside. She stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade down the dirt road. Then she put water on to boil and went to sleep, refusing to put a name to what she had felt during that 2-block walk, because she had learned that some things lose a little of themselves when they are named too soon. The years passed with that specific quality of time lived with presence, which seems brief when looked at from afar, but which is, while you are inside it, dense and real and complete. Eleanor's life in Deep Creek had true texture. The smell of chalk and wood in the classroom in the morning, the weight of the attendance ledger, the small but concrete satisfaction of watching a student finally grasp a concept they'd fought against for weeks. That specific expression that blooms on someone's face when a door that was locked suddenly swings open, which Eleanor had learned to recognize as one of the greatest spectacles available to those with eyes to see it. The conversations with Bea on the porch on Fridays, after the washing was done, over tea and whatever food was available. The Sunday church services, which Eleanor attended with the practical faith of people who believe but don't turn it into a performance. And Tuesdays, always Tuesdays. In 1929, the economic crisis that had started in the stock markets back east reached rural Oregon in the way crises always reach the country, slowly, then all at once, in the form of prices that soar and credit that vanishes, and money that becomes harder to find and vastly more valuable all at once. Simpson's General Store went through difficult months. Eleanor learned from Mr. O'Malley, the pharmacist, in a conversation not intended to be informative, that Arthur had reduced his own drawers from the register so he wouldn't have to fire his clerk, in that he had even delayed payments to his own supplier in Eugene so he wouldn't have to cut the credit of families who were struggling. She went to the store on a Wednesday. It wasn't Tuesday, but she went anyway, and said she had an idea she wanted to discuss. She proposed a relief fund among the town's merchants, a voluntary contribution for hard times, something simple but organized. She said she had spoken to O'Malley and the bakery owner, and they were open to it. She asked what he thought. He listened from start to finish without interrupting, with that attention that was one of his most constant and rarest qualities, the attention of someone who is truly listening and not formulating a response while they hear you. Then he stayed quiet for a second. Then he said it was a good idea, that he could organize the ledger of contributors if she wanted. He didn't say a word about his own troubles. He neither confirmed nor denied what she had heard from the pharmacist. It was his way, receiving help without calling it help, in the exact same way he offered it without calling it an offer. The following Tuesday, when she walked into the store, the mug of coffee was ready before she even reached the counter. He had heard her walk in and had already started pouring. A 1-second gesture that held a quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his private language for showing what he would not say. She stayed. They drank coffee. They talked about the crisis, about politics, about the wheat situation over in eastern Oregon, about a book they had both read in different weeks without coordinating it. When she left, she carried the same feeling she always did, that something had been said and unsaid at the very same time, that there was a layer beneath the surface that neither of them touched, but which was there with a presence that didn't diminish with time. The year 1932 was the hardest Deep Creek had endured in decades. A long drought at the end of summer preceded an exceptionally brutal winter, and the harvests of many surrounding farms came in well below what was needed to sustain the following year. The town felt it in the silence that lingers when the barn is emptier than it should be, in the way men stood idly in front of the store on Monday mornings, holding sums that simply didn't add up. Eleanor turned the school into a distribution center for provisions on the weekends. She organized lists, coordinated the handouts, and wrote to Portland begging for donations from charitable associations. Arthur supplied a vast portion of the distributed goods, flour, beans, cornmeal, lard, at wholesale cost if not entirely for free, without any announcements or speeches, just the way he always did things. They worked together in that effort for 3 full months, and it was during those months that Eleanor realized, with the clarity of things that appear when you are too busy to fend them off, that there was a synchrony between them that hadn't been taught or planned. She would start a task and he would finish it. She would need something and he was already holding it out. She was tallying the flour sacks and he already had his pencil sharpened to write it down. There was no verbal communication for this. There was just something that had grown in the silence of the years, the way the pines grow without anyone noticing, until one day you look up and they are enormous. It was B who named it first. It was inevitable that it would be B. On a March afternoon in 1933, on Eleanor's porch, with the fine autumn rain arriving with the scent of wet earth and the tea growing cold in their cups while they chatted about various things, B stated, without preamble, without ceremony, without the slightest padding of language, that Arthur Simpson loved her. Eleanor stared out at the rain for a long moment. Then she said B was exaggerating, that they were friends, that there were many ways to get along well with someone without it being love. B said yes, there were indeed many ways, and there was also the way that was love, which people called friendship because they were terrified of the other name. She pointed out that the Douglas fir right there in the yard, and she pointed to the largest of the three, which was getting truly massive, loved the Oregon cold. There was no signed agreement between the two, no conversation about it, and yet it was written in the very way the tree grew that it had been made for that specific climate and no other. Eleanor said B had been reading far too many books. B said she had read exactly enough. And she changed the subject with the elegance of someone who has said her piece and doesn't require confirmation. The image stuck. The great pine and the cold, the idea that some things are made for one another and grow in that direction without declarations, without deliberate choices, simply by the sheer nature of what they are. Eleanor kept that image to herself for a very, very long time. She didn't say anything to Arthur. She never did. Deep Creek's founding anniversary arrived in 1935 with a celebration larger than the town had thrown in years. Mayor Sullivan had calculated it was a sufficiently round number to justify a public banquet in the square, and the townsfolk agreed with his logic without question. There was a long tablecloth covered in dishes from every family in town. There was coffee served in huge enamel pots. There was O'Malley's fiddle playing for hours. And when night fell and the cold deepened with it, there was a bonfire the town boys had built that afternoon, which blazed with a competence they celebrated enthusiastically. After dinner, when the party entered that quieter winding-down phase, few people left in the square, families with young children already gone, the ones remaining being those who had more reason to stay. Eleanor walked over to the small wooden bridge over the creek that skirted the edge of the square, where the road ended and the land sloped gently toward the water. It was a spot where you could see the square from a slight distance, the chatter softened by the space and the sound of the water rushing underneath. She heard footsteps on the wooden planks. It was Arthur. He walked over to where she was and stood beside her, looking at the creek. The moon was high in the clear winter sky, and the water reflected it in agitated, shattered light. The great pines along the bank were dark shadows against the blue of the night. They stood for a long time in silence, not the uncomfortable silence of two strangers, but the comfortable silence of two people who are fine being together and don't need to fill the gap with words. Then he started to say something. Eleanor felt, more than she heard, that he was starting a sentence different from all the others. There was something in the weight of what hadn't yet been spoken that arrived before the words did, the way the smell of rain arrives before the rain. He said her name. He said Eleanor, with a tone that was different from his usual tone. There was something wide open in it, like when a window that has been stuck shut is yanked open and the air rushes in all at once. She turned her face to him. And then he stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was the silence of something that had come very close to existing and had retreated. He stood looking at the creek for a few seconds. Then he said, "Good night, Eleanor," his voice snapping shut back to its usual tone. like a window slamming back down, and he slowly walked off the bridge. She stood there for 20 minutes after he left, listening to the water, feeling the biting cold that Oregon delivered at that hour, trying to understand what had lived in the space between the first time he said her name and the second, and what had happened inside that space to make him choose not to cross it. She never asked. He never brought it up again. And life went on, the way life has an insistent, sometimes generous, and sometimes cruel habit of doing. In 1938, a traveling photographer passing through Deep Creek on his way to Eugene proposed a group photograph of the town's residents in the square. Most folks showed up. Families straightened up, men adjusted their collars, women smoothed their hair, and someone fetched a chair for Mrs. Cecilia, who had trouble standing for long. Eleanor wore a navy blue dress she saved for days that felt like they carried the weight of a memory. Arthur stood beside her because that was where he happened to be when people naturally organized themselves, and no one had thought to rearrange anyone. They stood side by side, waiting for the photographer to adjust his equipment for 10 minutes, chatting about nothing in particular with the same comfort as always. The photograph was developed weeks later and hung framed on the wall of the general store for years. In it, Arthur and Eleanor stood upright, not touching, looking at the photographer just like everyone else. But their shadows, cast upon the cobblestones of the square, fell in the exact same direction, at the exact same angle, and at the point where they met, they formed a single shadow that neither of them had noticed while the picture was being taken. Eleanor noticed it much later when she paused in front of the photo for some other reason, and her eyes fell to the bottom of the image almost by accident. She stared at it for a moment. She said nothing to anyone. The war years reached rural Oregon in the form of radio broadcasts. The store had purchased a set in 1941, a dark wood Philco that sat on a special shelf, and which Arthur tuned into during news hours with the same care he would use to tune an instrument. On Tuesdays, when there was a major bulletin, a small circle of people stood around the radio when Eleanor arrived. Local merchants, O'Malley the pharmacist, sometimes the Reverend, sometimes the visiting doctor, all wearing that specific solemnity of those who are very far from the facts, but understand that the facts are immense, and that their sheer size reaches them even from afar. Arthur read aloud the newspapers that arrived from Eugene a few days late. He read with a clear voice and without unnecessary commentary, delivering just the facts as the papers presented them. Afterward, when the others drifted away, he and Eleanor would stay a little longer and talk. She commented, he replied, and sometimes they disagreed, calmly, without shouting, with that intellectual respect that comes from truly taking another's thoughts seriously. He had become more direct in his opinions over the years, perhaps because he had learned that she wasn't frightened by disagreement and preferred honest debate over hollow agreement. It was in those moments that Eleanor felt most sharply what existed between them. It wasn't just comfort, nor just habit. It was a genuine fascination with the other's mind, with the way the other viewed the world, with what the other noticed that she had missed, and vice versa. It was the kind of interest that doesn't tire over time. Instead, it only grows. But she didn't say that, and he didn't say anything. The life between them was forged of presence and silence, of gestures rather than words, of accumulated years that had constructed something solid and real and unnamed between them, like a piece of wooden furniture built without blueprints, constructed piece by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, even if the design hadn't been written down anywhere. On a Tuesday in July 1946, he had set aside for her the only copy of Reader's Digest that had arrived that month, hiding it under the counter before any other customer could spot it. Eleanor only found out when she arrived, and he pulled it from beneath the counter without a word, with the exact same gesture of someone handing over something obvious and expected. She looked down at the magazine in her hands, then looked up at him, who had already returned to his ledger. She said he didn't need to do that. He said it was left over, that was all. She said it wasn't left over. It had been saved before it could be left over. He didn't answer, but there was a line in his mouth that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite indifference. It was the intermediate state between the two that she had learned, through the years and the Tuesdays and the night walks and the heavy silences, to recognize as his most honest expression of amusement. She took the magazine and read it all week long. The following Tuesday, she returned it by placing it on the counter. She said she had enjoyed an article about Japanese gardens, about how different cultures discovered beauty in the same principles without ever knowing one another. He said he had thought about that too. He said it was curious how the human need for organized beauty seemed universal, as if the human eye contained an internal geometry that recognized certain proportions, regardless of where it was raised. 10 minutes of conversation about Japanese gardens on a Tuesday in Deep Creek. She walked away, thinking there were very few people in the world with whom she could discuss Japanese gardens with such ease, with that dual pleasure of thinking out loud and being genuinely understood. Then she thought it wasn't about Japanese gardens. It had never been about Japanese gardens. Now I need to pause for a second because you've reached the middle of this story and I want to know what you are feeling. Leave a comment here. Tell me if you've ever had a love like this. That quiet love that stays and isn't spoken, that lives in the everyday without needing a name. Hit the thumbs up button too, because it really helps the channel keep bringing you stories that matter. And now come with me, because what happens from here on out is the part I promised you from the very beginning. The year 1948 brought an August rain that Eleanor used as an excuse to do what she had postponed for far too long: remodel the kitchen. The joists beneath the floorboards needed inspecting, and the carpenter she hired said he had to pull up a few planks in the corner of the pantry to check. On a Saturday afternoon, with the smell of old wood in the air and the rain drumming on the tin roof in a rhythm that made the work feel slower and more contemplative, Eleanor stood in the pantry while the carpenter worked in the parlour, and she was the one who noticed it first. The plank in the corner had a hollow space carved underneath it. It wasn't an accident. It was squared off even, the exact dimensions of a box. It was a cedar wood box with a fitted lid, bearing the initials PF carved in a handwriting that Eleanor immediately recognized, because she had grown up seeing those letters on the mail that arrived once a year on blue stationery. Prudence Fitzgerald. Inside were letters, many letters, organized by date, tied with a cotton ribbon that had faded to an unidentifiable beige. The oldest ones were from 1894, the most recent from 1920. There were dozens of envelopes featuring different handwriting, different voices, different people, decades of correspondence kept with the care of someone who knows that written words hold a weight that spoken ones do not. Eleanor sat on the pantry floor with the box in her lap and the rain falling outside, and she began to read. Prudence's letters were different from the ones her aunt had sent the family. These were not the polished letters of familial obligation. These were real letters, the kind people write when they are truly talking to someone, when distance permits an honesty that proximity sometimes hinders. There were letters to friends in Portland whom Eleanor had never met, letters to a reverend in Eugene with whom Prudence debated philosophy with a depth that surprised her niece, and then didn't surprise her. Because Prudence had always been a woman who thought much more than she showed. And there was one specific bundle, tied with a separate ribbon, the envelopes arranged in a different order. The letters to Edward Simpson, Arthur's father. Eleanor held the first envelope in her hand for a moment. Then she opened it with the care of someone who knows they are touching something they were never meant to touch. The letters between Prudence and Edward Simpson spanned from 1901 to 1915. They were the correspondence of two people who had met at a fair in Eugene, discovered that the world fit better into two heads than into one, and had maintained for 15 years a profound friendship that the distance between Portland and Deep Creek necessitated keeping epistolary. There was no declared romance. There was something else, and in a way, something much rarer. The intellectual and emotional intimacy of two people who respected each other deeply and who told each other what they told no one else. In a letter from 1908, Edward wrote about his son. Eleanor stopped at this one. Edward wrote that Arthur had turned 15 and that he was a quieter boy than his father had been, more contained, carrying his emotions inside like cargo he refused to set down. He wrote that he had tried to teach the boy that a man can feel, and that feeling isn't a weakness, but the country school taught otherwise, and the country school was more persistent than any father. He wrote that he hoped the boy would find, in due time, someone who would teach him without teaching, by example, by patience, by the simple presence of someone who lives differently. Eleanor held that letter in her hands for a while, as the rain continued without a care. She kept reading. Edward's letters to Prudence dwindled in frequency in the following years. The man's health had worsened, and running the store had become heavier after an accident that kept him away from work for months. Edward's final letter was from 1914, a year before he died. It was written in a different script than the others, slower, more deliberate, as if it cost him more. He wrote that he worried for Arthur. The boy had taken over the store with competence, but work was work, and it wasn't a whole life. He said his son needed more than work, that he needed someone who would truly see him, and that he, Edward, wouldn't live to see that happen, which was the only thing that truly weighed heavy on him. Prudence's final letter to Edward was an answer he never read. It was written 2 weeks after she learned of his passing in October 1915. It was a mourning letter that was also a promise, but a promise not clearly stated, because Prudence didn't yet know how the promise would be fulfilled. She simply wrote that she would watch over what remained, that she was in the habit of planting seeds without knowing what would grow, and that sometimes that's just how it was. And then, tucked away from everything else, was a paper that wasn't a letter. It was a sheet of blue stationery folded in half, with no envelope, no address, no date of posting. It was written in 1920, 2 years before Prudence's death, 2 years before Eleanor's journey to Deep Creek. It was a letter that had never been sent to anyone, or that had been written for someone who was no longer there to receive it, or it was simply a woman thinking out loud. A woman who thought deeply and wrote her thoughts down because writing them was her way of making them real enough to examine. Eleanor opened the paper carefully, with the rain drumming and the smell of old cedar filling the pantry. Prudence was writing about her. She wrote that she had a brilliant, solitary niece in Portland who had broken off a convenient engagement because there was something in Eleanor, there always had been, that knew there was something better waiting somewhere. Even if she didn't know where. She wrote that there was a town in rural Oregon where the air was clean and the pines were massive, and there was a general store on a corner whose side window stayed open on warm days, letting the wind carry the smell of roasted coffee. She wrote that there was a man in this store who was the son of a dear friend who had grown up carrying his emotions like cargo he didn't know how to set down. Then she wrote, "Perhaps it is them. Perhaps not. But it seems to me that a woman with Eleanor's eyes and a man with Arthur's heart could at the very least look at each other up close. What happens after that is not my job. It is their job. My job is merely the house and the reason and 3 days. The rest I leave to them, to the time and to the place, which are the best arrangers of any story." Eleanor read that paragraph 3 times. Then she sat on the pantry floor with the letter in her lap and the rain on the roof and the smell of cedar all around, holding the paper of a dead woman who had orchestrated all of this with the serenity and intelligence of someone who plants a seed and knows the earth will do the rest, the house, the inheritance, the 3 days, Mr. Farnsworth's purposely delayed paperwork. Everything had been, to some degree, designed by those hands writing with a rightward slant, with the calm of someone who doesn't need to see the result to trust in it. Her aunt had gambled. She had placed a bet based on what she knew of both of them. Eleanor's nature, Arthur's nature, the nature of the place, and had set the stage and trusted that the people would do what people do when they are right for each other. Find one another. Eleanor had stayed. For 26 years, up to that moment, she had stayed. And for 26 years, Prudence had been right about everything, except the part where she said the rest was their job, because they hadn't done the job. She slowly closed the cedar box and placed it on the pantry shelf, between the canning jars, in a spot where she could see it every time she went to fetch anything. She stared at it for a moment. She never told Arthur what she had found. Not back then. Life went on as it had always gone on, with that quality of time that is lived with attention and without urgency, the kind of time that is perhaps the most precious of all, because it doesn't feel like it's running out, even when it is. And then came October 1952. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It came with the mail Eleanor picked up at the store once a week, on the same day she got her coffee and did her shopping and spent time at the counter talking to Arthur. He handed her the bundle of mail alongside the mug as always, and she flipped through the envelopes, standing up as always, and there was a letter from Portland featuring her nephew Richard's handwriting on the envelope. Handwriting she recognized because it was too neat for most occasions, the script of someone taught that penmanship says something about a person's character. She opened it later, alone, at the very kitchen table where she had read Prudence's letters 4 years prior. Richard wrote with the care of someone trying to say something difficult without causing hurt, while knowing he wouldn't entirely succeed. He explained that Eleanor's mother, 81 years old, her mind still sharp, but a body beginning to exact the toll time demands, had suffered a fall. Nothing was badly broken, but she had lost some mobility and required more care than Richard and his family could manage alone. There was a teaching position open at the excellent school where Richard worked as an administrator. The family missed her. There was, he wrote with the delicacy of someone who knows the offer might sound lesser than it is, a room waiting for her. He concluded by saying, "Aunt Eleanor, you have built a beautiful thing out there all these years, but your family needs you. Perhaps it is time to come back." Eleanor folded the letter. She placed it on the table with her other papers and stared out the kitchen window for a long time. The pines stood in the late autumn chill with that dense, impassive dark green that the great firs maintain regardless of the season, because a Douglas fir doesn't change for the autumn. It is a tree that has decided it will remain. The light angled through the window with that specific slant of late afternoon, making the floorboards glow in a golden band she had seen every day for 30 years, and which still stopped her sometimes, just like the very first time. 30 years. She thought about that. 30 years in Deep Creek, 30 years of the school, of the students who had passed through it and were now adults with lives she had helped, in some small but real measure, to build. 30 years of the creak of the firs, of the June cold, of the Tuesdays. He had never said a word. She had waited, not in the active way of people who wait with impatience and a drafted plan, in the way things stay and grow while you aren't looking, until one day you realize they are enormous, but you don't know exactly when they got that way. She had waited without realizing she was waiting, and now there was the letter on the table, and a mother who had fallen, and an open room in Portland, and 30 years of the unsaid that could very well remain unsaid forever. She reread the letter. Then she picked up paper and pen and wrote back to Richard. She was well, she thanked him, she would arrive in November. She folded the letter, sealed the envelope and went to sleep. In the days that followed, the town discovered, the way small towns discover everything, by osmosis, by deduction, but mostly by B, that Eleanor Fitzgerald was leaving. Folk started showing up at the school and at her house for the kind of visit that is a goodbye disguised as casual chatter. Mrs. Cecilia, the widow with the roof, now over 70, with a much slower walk but the exact same eyes, came by for tea one afternoon and spent 2 hours without mentioning the departure directly. But when she left, she gripped Eleanor's hand at the gate with a strength that said exactly what the words hadn't. Mr. Daniels came by during a morning recess. He said the school was ready to carry on. He said this with more firmness than sorrow, because Daniels had grown during his years of partnership with Eleanor and was now a fine teacher who knew what he was doing. Eleanor thanked him and said yes, the school was ready, which had been exactly the goal. Arthur said nothing. On the Tuesday of the following week, the second to last Tuesday before she was to leave, she went to the store as always. The coffee was ready as always. They talked about the weather, about the new road being paved up to Eugene, about an article in the Portland paper concerning Oregon's prospects for the coming decade. They talked the way they had always talked, with that comfort of 30 years of Tuesdays, and when she left, he said, "Good afternoon, Eleanor," with his usual voice. She said, "Good afternoon, Arthur." She walked out of the store with her shopping bag and went 2 blocks toward her house. Then she stopped in the middle of the street, without knowing exactly when she had decided to stop. She stood in the middle of the dirt road, holding her bag, with the October sun on the great pines ahead. The smell of resin hung in the crisp air. A dog barked a block away and then went quiet. The wind in the pine canopies made that soft, continuous rushing sound she had learned to distinguish from every other sound in the world. Then she kept walking. Bea went to the store that very afternoon after 6 o'clock, when the last customers had gone, and Arthur was shutting the front blinds with the systematic manner of someone doing the same thing every single day, allowing him to think about something else entirely. She came in through the back door, which was unlocked because it always was, and stood in the middle of the store with her arms crossed over her chest and the expression of someone who didn't drop by on accident, and wasn't leaving until she said what she came to say. He asked what had happened. Bea said nothing had happened. She said that was exactly the problem, that nothing had happened, that nothing had been said, and that Eleanor Fitzgerald was leaving next week for Portland, and was the sort of woman who, once a decision was made, didn't undo it for minor reasons. Arthur stood quiet behind the counter. The store held that specific stillness of places that are suddenly empty after a lot of movement. The familiar smell of coffee and kerosene and wood, the shelves of aligned tins, the ledger open to the day's page. Bea said she wasn't going to beat around the bush because it had never been her style, and it was far too late to start now. She said Eleanor had arrived in Deep Creek in April 1922 and had stayed because there were reasons to stay that no one had needed to list out loud, and that one of those reasons was currently standing on the other side of the counter, looking like he didn't fully comprehend what he was hearing. She said she had waited 30 years to see either of them have the common sense to do something about what lay between them, and that she had lost her patience in definitive style. She said Eleanor was leaving next week, that she was traveling early in the morning, that what he did or did not do with this information was entirely his choice, and that she, Bea, had done the part that fell to her. She walked out the back door without waiting for an answer and without looking back. Arthur stood perfectly still behind the counter for a length of time he wouldn't be able to pin down later. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been much longer. The store was quiet around him, with the specific stillness of things that are waiting. The kerosene lamp threw shadows against the walls, the shelves with the tins, the kerosene barrel, the ledger open to the page of the day with the numbers he had tallied late in the afternoon. 30 years. He closed the ledger, he blew out the lamp, he walked out. Eleanor was on the porch when she heard footsteps on the front path. It was late at night. A clear, cold moon had risen over the pines, and the October cold possessed that transparent, dry quality that Oregon maintains on cloudless nights, the kind of cold that makes the air shimmer slightly in the dark. She had finished dinner and sat holding a cup of cool tea, wearing a wool coat over her dress, sitting on one of the two porch benches, watching the great pines rendered into dense black silhouettes against the bright sky by the moonlight. She recognized the footsteps before she saw him. She had recognized those footsteps for 30 years. He came through the gate holding a book in his hand. It was a book she had lent him 8 years ago, a collection of essays by a New England writer, which she had remembered while packing her belongings, had looked for on the shelf, hadn't found, and then had remembered where it was. He said he had come to return it. He said it in a voice that sounded perfectly reasonable, the way voices sound when they're doing a very careful job of covering something else up. She looked at the book. Then she looked at him. She said she had been waiting for the borrower of that book for 8 years. He said he was a slow man regarding certain things. There was something different about him that night. She noticed it the second her eyes fell upon him, a different quality of presence, as if he had made a decision that was altering something internally, a change that rose to the surface in his posture, in the way he stood, in something she couldn't fully name but instantly recognized. It wasn't nerves. It was the absolute opposite of nerves. It was the profound stillness of someone who had stopped holding something back. She told him to come inside. She made tea. They sat at the kitchen table, both with their hands wrapped around their cups, under the glow of the kerosene lamp, casting golden light on the wooden walls. Outside, the silence of Deep Creek was total at that hour, the kind of silence that never happens in big cities, but which in rural towns is as natural as breathing, a silence that isn't an absence, but the presence of something immensely quiet. For a while, neither of them said anything. But it was a silence completely unlike the others. It was a silence that knew it was the last of its kind, and was hoarding the moment precisely because of it. He was the one who started. He asked, his voice measured but carrying something underneath that was not measured at all, if she was certain about leaving. She said her family needed her. He said he understood. A pause. The lamp flickered from a draught, finding its way through a crack. The shadows on the walls swayed and settled. Outside, the wind brushed the crowns of the great firs, making that soft, continuous rushing noise she had learned to distinguish from all others. It was the most familiar sound she knew, the sound of 30 years. Then he said there were things he didn't know how to name. He said he had never known, that he had grown up learning that naming a thing wasn't required for the thing to exist, and that he had carried that principle entirely too far for entirely too long. He said he had come tonight because B had said something that sooner or later someone was bound to say, and that when it was spoken aloud, it had sounded vastly different than when it just lived inside. Because things spoken out loud carry a weight the unspoken ones do not, even when the unspoken ones are devastatingly real. She stayed quiet. She waited. She had known how to wait for 30 years. He said he thought of her every Tuesday before she arrived. He said he had caught himself checking the quality of the coffee beans before Tuesdays with a level of care applied to no other customer, and that it had taken him longer than it should have to admit that this wasn't mere professionalism. He said there was a time, on a bridge over the creek during the town anniversary, when he had started to say something and stopped because he got scared. He couldn't say exactly what of changing what existed between them perhaps, of naming it and losing a thing that functioned perfectly because it had no name. He said that pause had cost him years. He said this in a direct, undramatic way, which was exactly his way of saying difficult things, without drama but without diminishing the gravity. He said he had called what he felt friendship because he didn't know what else to call it. That friendship was a word roomy enough to fit many things, and he had crammed more into that word than it was meant to hold, simply for lack of a better one. That when B spoke the true name aloud that afternoon, the name had sounded right in the way only true things sound, without surprise, without resistance, just as the recognition of something that already was. Eleanor sat staring at her own hands wrapped around the teacup. The tea was cold. She hadn't touched it. The moment she had waited for had arrived, not actively, not with a master plan, but which had lingered there as a possibility for 30 entire years, and now it was real and sitting on the kitchen table between them, carrying the weight of things that finally step into the light. She said she was going to tell him something she had never told anyone. She told him about the cedar box, about Prudence and Edward's letters, his father, who had been a deep friend to her aunt for 15 years of correspondence, about the unsent letter written in 1920, about what her aunt had written concerning a niece who needed a place and a man who needed someone to truly see him, about the silent gamble of a woman who had left a house and a reason and 3 days, trusting that the rest would be handled by the people involved. When she finished, she looked at him and said her aunt had done her part, and that the two of them had taken a little bit longer than expected to do theirs. There was a small laugh at the end of that, not a laugh of easy humor, but the kind of laugh that comes from suddenly seeing your own life from the exact right angle, the angle where all the pieces click together and you can finally see the design that was there the whole time. Arthur stayed quiet for a moment, looking at her. Then he stood up. He walked over to the kitchen window, the window with the view of the pines, the very window Eleanor had opened on her first day and had opened every day since. He stood with his back to her, looking outside. She could see his shoulders in the soft lamplight, the same shoulders she had first seen in the store 30 years ago, bent a little more now by the weight of the decades, but possessing the very same solidness. He said yes, he understood. He said he had understood, perhaps, even before B had spoken. He had understood it during the week of silence that had passed since he learned of her departure, when every day had felt smaller and harder without anything concrete having changed, and he had realized that a town doesn't shrink for physical reasons, but for internal ones, dictated by who inhabits it from the inside. He said it had taken him 30 years to find the courage for a 5-word note, and it had taken him another 30 to find the courage for this night. He said this with a seriousness that wasn't severity. It was the tone of someone being deeply honest about a thing that had cost them dearly. He turned from the window. He looked at her. He said she should leave if she needed to leave, that he hadn't come to beg her to stay because that wouldn't be fair, and he knew what fairness was. But he had come because she deserved to know, after 30 years, after the Tuesdays and the bridge and the firewood and the 5-word note and everything that had been said and unsaid, she deserved to know what had been waiting on the other side of all of it. Now, before what comes next, I need you to do one thing for me. If this story is touching your heart, hit the like button now, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single story. You've made it this far. The ending deserves your complete attention. Come with me. Eleanor kept her eyes on him for a moment, possessing the density of things that do not pass quickly, because they aren't meant to pass quickly. The kerosene lamp, the cold creeping in under the door, the great firs in the dark outside, which existed before them and would continue on long after. Then she looked toward the window, the black pines against the moon, the 3 massive firs Prudence had planted decades earlier that were now so tall you had to tilt your head back to see the crown. The smell of pine resin drifted in even through the closed glass, soft and constant as it always had. She said she was going to tell him how the 3rd day had gone. She said she had packed her suitcase that April morning in 1922 with the genuine intention of leaving. That she had thought about Portland, the apartment, the school, the life waiting for her. That she had made tea and thought of every practical, legitimate reason to go back. But she had also thought of one specific thing. She had thought of a man on a widow's roof, in a biting cold, that he was under no obligation to face, repairing shingles that weren't his, which no one had asked him to fix. And she had thought, that morning by the kitchen window, there is a kind of kindness that is small in gesture and enormous in what it reveals about the one who practices it. And the person who does that enormous small thing without realizing they are revealing anything at all, that person is worth knowing up close. They are worth staying close to. She said she had unpacked the suitcase. She said she had waited after that. Not impatiently, not with a master plan, not ticking off days. In the way a Douglas fir grows, without urgency, without a deadline, trusting that time and place would do what needed to be done. She said she had learned to put a name to what she felt for him around the 2nd or 3rd year. It had hit her one winter afternoon while she was grading papers at the kitchen table, and it arrived completely formed, without warning, the way things arrive when they finally stop being contained. But she had chosen not to say the name out loud because she thought naming it would change something that was functioning flawlessly without a name. She said it had been an idiotic decision that had lasted 30 years. He stood looking at her from the window. The moon was high now, and the room was bathed in soft light and quiet shadow. Then he walked back and sat down at the table. And then they talked. Not about love in the abstract. That wasn't the style of either of them. They talked about concrete moments, about specific years, about the firewood in 1923 and the fact that B had never said a word, about the Jubilee in 1925 and the 2-block walk, and how he had known that the distance between the square and her house had been calculated one way and traversed another. About the 5-word note, and he went quiet when she mentioned she had kept it for decades, and then he stated, his voice not entirely steady, that he had seen the note once, years later, sitting on her desk during a Tuesday when she had gone to fetch something from the bedroom and left him alone at the counter for a minute. He had seen it, said nothing, walked back to the store, and spent the entire afternoon trying to decipher what it meant, ultimately concluding he simply didn't have enough courage for the answer. She said he had been remarkably slow. He said he had been far too slow. He said it without defending himself, because it was the truth, and he made a habit of the truth. Then she said, and she said it with a voice that wasn't entirely steady, but was absolutely clear, that she had spent the whole week packing her suitcase and believing she was doing the right thing. That she had thought of her mother, of Richard, of obligations, of family, of all the legitimate reasons the letter presented, and they were indeed legitimate. That she had considered all of it. But there was also 30 years. There were the pines. There were the Tuesdays. There was a man who had come to return a book he had kept for 8 years, on a night when there was no time left to keep anything. She said she was going to write Richard in the morning, that she would go to Portland to see her mother, stay as long as necessary, help with whatever was needed, but that she wasn't moving back. She said the room Richard had set aside was a kindness she thanked him for from the bottom of her heart, but her room had a window facing the pines, an iron stove, and faded blue curtains she had decided to keep because they were prettier than anything brand new. Arthur stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said it was a good window to have. She said she knew. They talked until nearly 3 in the morning. Not with urgency, nor with any rush to make up for lost time. There was no time left to make up for. Time was what it had been, and that was settled. They talked the way they had always talked, with the singular difference that the words were now surfacing from a much deeper place and travelling much further. When he left, the moon had sunk quite low, and the great firs had taken on that specific quality of things growing darker as the night pushes toward the other side. She stood on the porch and listened to his footsteps fading down the dirt road in the pre-dawn silence of Deep Creek, Oregon, with the crisp cold all around and the massive silent pines standing watch. She stood there until she heard nothing but the wind in the canopy, Then she went back inside, walked into her bedroom, and opened her suitcase. She began unpacking it slowly, like someone dismantling something that had been built by mistake, unhurriedly, without drama, merely with the tranquility of things correcting themselves when the hour for correction has finally arrived. The trip to Portland happened in November 1952, just as she had promised. Eleanor stayed for 2 months. She saw her mother, sat beside her in the afternoons, listened to the stories people hear during afternoons with the elderly, which are the most important stories of all. She helped Richard organize a few practical arrangements. She visited the school where a position had been waiting. It was a fine school, with sturdy architecture and diligent students, but it was a school with no great firs outside the window. She returned to Deep Creek in January 1953. Carrying the worn brown leather suitcase that had first arrived in that town in April 1922. The wagon that brought her from the Eugene station rolled into town on a late summer afternoon. The sun still high, the air thick with heated pine resin, and the creek making its usual rushing noise as it headed for the valley. The great pines wore that dark green color that never changes. It hadn't changed in 30 years. It hadn't changed in the weeks she was away, because a Douglas fir simply does not change. The general store was open. She walked in with her suitcase, placed it on the dark wood counter, and said she had arrived and would very much like a cup of coffee if there was any. There was. It was ready. They drank black coffee at the store counter on a late afternoon in January 1953, with the town coming and going outside and the pines visible through the side window, which was propped open because it was hot. There was no formal declaration. There was no ceremony. That was the sort of thing that had always existed between them, understood without needing an explanation, spoken through presence rather than words. What existed between them was what had been there for 30 years, with the sole difference that now it had a name. And the name hadn't changed a single thing about the way they were. It had only confirmed it. In October 1954, 2 years after that final night of kerosene light and pines and cold tea and words that had waited decades to be spoken, Arthur Simpson and Eleanor Fitzgerald were married in the little stone church in Deep Creek, Oregon, in a simple ceremony on a Saturday afternoon, with the autumn sun pouring through the windows with that slanted light it holds at that hour. The entire town attended, not because they were people of great importance to the world's news, but because they were people of immense importance in that town and in those lives, and because there was a story here that everyone had followed closely for long enough to feel that the day somehow belonged to them too. Bea sat in the front row, wearing a green dress she had commissioned especially for the occasion. She claimed green was the color of hope and also of the great pines, which were exactly the same thing. She cried from beginning to end, with the specific serenity of someone who weeps not out of surprise, but sheer satisfaction, the calm tears of someone who watched something take a very long time and finally happen, and who had long ago made peace with the fact that the timing was not hers to decide. When the ceremony ended, and the guests spilled out into the square where a long table was waiting, Bea stayed inside the little church a moment longer. She looked at the altar, looked at the flowers, looked at the light streaming through the window. Then she smiled to herself with the expression of someone who has just closed out a very long ledger and found the balance to be good. Arthur was 65, Eleanor was 59. The store sat on the corner, its side window open on warm days, letting in the smell of pine resin and the sound of the wind through the firs. The house with the porch and the garden sat 2 blocks away, guarded by the great pines Prudence had planted decades earlier, which were now immense, the kind you have to tilt your head back to see the tops of, casting shade over half the yard in the afternoon, and which, on windy nights, made that sound that was the most familiar sound Eleanor knew in the entire world. They lived between one place and the other with the ease of people who never had to decide a thing, because the choice had already been made internally a very long time ago. And Tuesdays continued. They always continued. The coffee was still poured when she arrived. The only difference was that she no longer had to travel far to get there, but she arrived all the same, every Tuesday, through the front door, with the distinct sound of her own footsteps that he had learned to recognize from anywhere inside the store, just the same way the great firs recognize the cold that raised them. The town of Deep Creek, Oregon, told this story for a very long time. They told of the woman who came for 3 days and stayed for 30 years, and of the man who took 3 decades to understand what he carried inside him the entire time, and of the aunt who planted a seed with the calm of someone who knows the earth will handle the rest, provided the seed is good. And when folks reach the very end, they always took that pause. The pause of someone who needs a moment to let the thing settle exactly where it's meant to settle. Because the story said something everyone recognized from somewhere deep down, touching a place inside people that doesn't age, because it isn't made of the sort of material that ages. It said that the truest love isn't always the loudest, that sometimes it looks like a mug of coffee every Tuesday, like firewood appearing unasked at the door, like a 5-word note kept in the back of a drawer for decades, because nothing else in that drawer felt more valuable than that piece of paper. That sometimes love takes all the time it needs to take, and that it arrives just the same, and is valid just the same, and is built much more solid because of everything it weathered before it finally earned a name, and that it is never too late to speak what is true, as long as there is still someone there to hear it. The year 1934 reached Oregon with an early winter. By May there was already frost in the early hours, and the garden patches behind the houses woke up blanketed in a fine white that the 9 o'clock sun slowly erased, as if rubbing a soft eraser over a drawing. Eleanor had expanded Prudence's vegetable garden that year. She had added a row of celery, another of carrots, and a bed of aromatic herbs she called her patch of smells: mint, basil, rosemary, sage. She told anyone who asked that an herb garden is like a collection of memories. Each plant carries a scent that exists inside you before you even crush the leaves, coming from somewhere far older than consciousness. On a Monday in June of that year, she arrived at the school at her usual time and found sitting on her desk a sprig of rosemary tucked into a glass of water. There was no note. There was no name. The sprig had been cut carefully, to the exact length that fit the glass without bending. She asked Mr. Daniels if it was him. Daniels said no. She asked the janitor, Mrs. Elsie, who always arrived before everyone else. Mrs. Elsie said she had found the sprig near the door when she opened the schoolhouse, and had put it in the glass because it looked like something not to be wasted. Eleanor stared at the rosemary for a moment. Then she set it on the windowsill, where it caught the morning sun, and went about her day. She never asked the owner. The owner never confessed it had been him. But from the schoolyard to the window of the general store, there was a direct line of sight to Eleanor's garden that anyone walking down the street early enough could easily catch. And there was only one type of person in Deep Creek who opened his business at 6 in the morning and regularly passed by the school on his way back from hauling supplies from the depot. The sprig of rosemary lasted 2 weeks in the glass before drying out. Eleanor kept it in her school supplies drawer, pressed between 2 sheets of butcher paper, right alongside the 5-word note. The winter of 1936 was the coldest Deep Creek had felt in many years. The temperature plummeted so fiercely during 1 week in July that the fountain in the square froze over for the first time any resident could recall, and the town's children crowded around it early in the morning with that blend of awe and glee that the unusual sparks when you are small enough to believe the world holds limitless surprises. The adults looked on and grew solemn, because adults know that a frozen fountain is beautiful, but it also signals practical supply problems that will need solving. Eleanor had caught a flu early that week. It wasn't a severe flu, but it was the stubborn kind that knocked her flat for 3 days. 3 days she spent in bed with that specific impatience of active people forced to be sick, which differs from other kinds of impatience because it carries the acute awareness of everything going undone outside while the body refuses to cooperate. She coughed, read, coughed some more, tried to grade papers, gave up because her eyes wouldn't focus properly, and stared at the wooden ceiling with the expression of someone taking inventory of all the commitments piling up. On the afternoon of the second day, she heard the front gate open with the distinct sound it made. A slightly high-pitched squeak she had discovered varied with the temperature. In the cold it grew sharper, like an instrument responding to the weather. Then footsteps on the porch. Then a knock, not on the front door, which she hadn't unlocked because she was in bed, but on the bedroom window facing the porch, which was the method folks she knew used when they wanted to see if someone was home without intruding. She got up with a blanket draped over her shoulders, walked to the window and opened it. It was Arthur, holding an earthenware crock tied shut with a cloth over the top. He said Bea had told him she was sick. He said he had made chicken broth because that was the thing to make. He said this all in the practical voice of someone listing off measures taken, not seeking approval for having taken them. Eleanor looked at the crock. It was still hot. She felt the heat radiating through the clay when he set it on the windowsill. She said she was fine. It wasn't anything serious, that there was no need. He stated that chicken broth did no harm to those who were well and was useful to those who were unwell, meaning there was no scenario in which the broth was the wrong decision. She stared at that logic for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He told her to send word if she needed anything else. He turned on his heel, walked around the porch, and exited through the gate with that squeak specific to the cold. Eleanor stood holding the crock, feeling the heat bleed into her palms. The afternoon was grey and freezing, smelling of the wood smoke that coated the entire street during that brutal winter. Outside, the great firs were dark, motionless silhouettes against a leaden sky. She carried the broth into the kitchen and ate straight from the crock, sitting at the table with the blanket still around her shoulders, tasting that exact flavor of broth made with patience, with the right spices added at the right time. The kind of broth someone only makes when they are willing to wait. She sat thinking about the person who had made it, about those large hands that wrote in tiny, meticulous script in a ledger, hands that had boiled chicken bones on a winter afternoon because Bea had mentioned she had a fever. She sat with that thought for a long time after finishing. She washed the crock carefully and returned it the following Tuesday, when she was recovered. She placed the crock on the counter alongside a small loaf of bread she had baked that morning, because returning an empty vessel had always struck her as rude. He looked at the bread. He said it wasn't necessary. She said she knew. They stood in silence for a moment with that quality their silence always possessed, filled with things neither of them named, yet which truly existed, as solid and real as the dark wood counter between them. He cut the bread in half and slid one half back toward her. He said it was too big for just one person. She accepted it. They drank their coffee with the bread on that Tuesday in July of 1936, with the Oregon cold howling outside and the smell of coffee and wood wrapping the store. And it was quite probably one of the finest moments of an ordinary Tuesday the two of them had ever shared, for no special reason. Just the precise combination of simple elements that sometimes find the perfect measure without anyone having planned it. The year 1937 brought political changes that reached the rural corners of the country in the form of radio broadcasts and newspapers, bringing a different timbre to the conversations of the men lingering out front of the general store on Monday mornings. Deep Creek was no exception to the history of the nation. It was merely another small dot on the grand map where massive events arrived filtered by distance and interpreted through the common sense of folks who live by concrete labor and hold little patience for political abstraction. Opinions varied as they varied everywhere. Conversations occasionally grew heated. O'Malley, the pharmacist, and Mayor Sullivan disagreed regularly, with that specific ferocity of men who respect one another deeply and therefore pull no punches. Eleanor and Arthur followed it all with close attention. She with the perspective of someone who hailed from Portland and possessed ties to the wider world beyond the town. He with the perspective of someone who knew the country from the inside out, who understood how grand decisions trickled down and either changed or entirely failed to change the small things that made up the real life of any place. On a Tuesday in September of 1937, their conversation was one of the longest they had ever had. It began with politics and meandered into history, then philosophy, and Eleanor realized at some point during her second cup of coffee that they had been talking for almost 2 hours without either of them noticing the time slipping away. It was the kind of conversation you recognize afterward by a slight shock at the clock, when you glance over and discover that time had been doing something entirely different than what you thought it was doing while you were lost inside the dialogue. There was a specific quality of freedom in those conversations, the freedom to disagree without it costing a thing, to shift a stance without it feeling like weakness, to reach the end without a firm conclusion and without feeling frustrated by it. It was the quality of conversations between people who respect each other profoundly enough that neither feels the need to win. Eleanor left that Tuesday much too late for supper, her head filled with the kind of thoughts that take days to fully settle. She walked home thinking that there were very few people in the world with whom a conversation left you with this. Not answers, not certainties, but the distinct sensation that your own mind had expanded a little, that there was space inside her that simply hadn't been there before she started speaking. After supper, while washing dishes in the cold water from the pump, smelling the lye soap around her, she thought about how whatever existed between them was something she still hadn't named, but which had been growing silently for 15 years, just like the great pines in the yard that were taller every time she stopped to look at them, even if she had never caught them in the actual act of growing. She dried her hands. She went to her bedroom. She stared at the wooden ceiling for a stretch of time, far longer than she had planned, before finally falling asleep. The year 1939 was the year the Deep Creek School turned 16. Eleanor had arranged a small celebration. Nothing grand, nothing formal, merely a gathering of the students who had passed through the school in the years since it opened, those who still lived in town or nearby. More showed up than she had expected. There were faces of all ages, people she had known when they were small, who were now adults with trades and families and histories of their own, which had unfolded out of her sight, but had begun, in some small measure, in those 2 wooden rooms smelling of chalk dust. She stood before that entire group for a moment before she started speaking, feeling something that wasn't exactly pride. It was something quieter and deeper than pride. The satisfaction of things done with a purpose that proved themselves worthy of that purpose. There is no guarantee that what we plant will grow the way we hope. But when it does, the feeling carries a specific texture that Eleanor recognized in that moment with a clarity that surprised her. Arthur stood in the back, leaning against the wall of the schoolhouse, with his arms crossed, and the expression he wore during moments when he was observing something with a blend of absolute attention and quiet satisfaction. She caught his eye once while speaking to the group, and his expression in that instant was that of someone witnessing a thing they know to be inherently good, requiring no external metric to prove it. After the celebration, when the crowd had dispersed and the school grew quiet, smelling of the coffee someone had brewed and the cake Bea had brought, which vanished at a speed that truly honored the baker, Eleanor remained alone, straightening the chairs that had been moved. Arthur had stayed too, without anyone asking, and began gathering the cups and paper plates with the same applied method of someone finishing up a concrete task. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then he said, without stopping his work, that the celebration had been a fine idea. She said she thought so too. She said she hadn't known beforehand if anyone would come and had been surprised by how many showed up. He said it wasn't a surprise to him. She asked why. He stayed quiet for a second. Then he said people show up for the reasons that make them show up, and that in the case of this event, the reason was a teacher who had taught in a way that stayed with those who were taught, and that kind of thing doesn't just wash away. He said this in his usual practical voice, without embellishment, lacking the quality of an explicit compliment that would have embarrassed them both equally. But nestled inside those sentences was a clarity of judgment that she received. Not with the awkwardness of a compliment, but with the distinct quality of recognition that comes from someone you respect right back. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." They finished straightening the chairs in silence. The year 1941 brought the radio, and with it, the entire world pushed its way with heavier presence into the Deep Creek General Store. But it also brought something smaller, more mundane, and in a way far more vital to both of their lives. It brought a new habit. Every Thursday after 8 at night, when the news bulletin ended and the store closed, Arthur read. He had always read. The bookshelf in his home proved that. But that year, for some reason he never explained and Eleanor never asked about, he began leaving the books he finished on the store counter. A slip of paper marking the last page read, so that when she walked in the following Tuesday, he was deep into a new book, and the previous one was sitting right there. She had picked up the first one by accident. She had arrived earlier than usual. The book was resting on the counter with the paper marking it, and she asked if she could flip through it while waiting for the coffee. He said she could, that he was finished with it. She took it home. She returned it the next week with comments he listened to intently. He replied with his own. The book exchange, without an agreement, without formality, simply through the natural accumulation of weeks that morphed a habit into a system, became part of their Tuesdays. There was something in it that felt different from merely discussing books each had read independently. It was reading the exact same copy in sequence, him first, her second, and discovering that the passages each had mentally underlined were different, that the sentences that stuck were different, that the identical text had produced distinct echoes in each of them, echoes that revealed themselves in conversation. Eleanor learned more about how Arthur's mind worked, how he filtered the world, what lingered with him from a page, through those exchanges than she had in all the previous years of talking about other subjects. And she suspected the reverse was equally true, because sometimes he would comment on something she had noted, and the way he spoke suggested the surprise of recognition, as if he had found, from a different angle, something he had been searching for. One day in August 1942, a book entered the exchange that neither of them had initiated. It was a volume of 19th-century poetry that had arrived in a shipment of used books the bookseller in Eugene sent quarterly to the store, an old arrangement of Edward Simpson's that Arthur continued out of habit, and because the books always found a buyer. The book was on the counter when she arrived. He said it had come in the week before, and he thought she might like it. She leafed through it. She read a few poems standing up, right there at the counter, her coffee cooling beside her. She stopped at a poem about the way oceans separate and connect simultaneously, about how the exact same water standing between two distinct points is also the very thing that permits passage from one to the other, that the distance and the bridge are made of the exact same sea. She read the poem out loud to him, without thinking, yielding to that specific impulse born when standing before something beautiful, the urge to share it immediately, before reflection can edit the gesture. When she finished, there was silence. He said it was good. She said yes, it was. She folded down the corner of the page, closed the book, and took it home. That dog-eared page remained exactly like that until the day she dusted it off many years later and found the corner still folded just as she had left it. The autumn of 1943 brought a strange drought to Oregon. not the kind of dryness that burns, but the kind of dryness that decelerates, leaving the air uncommonly clear and the soil with a quality of waiting that farmers know in their bones, leaving them with that silent tension of men monitoring the sky without wanting anyone else to know they are monitoring it. The war news arrived heavy that autumn. The radio in the store was tuned in at specific hours, and folks gathered with the solemnity the sheer scale of events overseas demanded, even if those events were far enough away not to directly touch their lives in Deep Creek. Eleanor wrote letters to her family in Portland more frequently during that period. There was a different quality to the awareness of time during the war years, the feeling that the days held a weight ordinary days lacked, that the world was moving through something that would have to be told entirely differently later on, once there was enough distance to see it. She wrote this to her mother, who replied with the serene wisdom of people who have survived hard times before, and learned that continuation is, in and of itself, a form of resistance. At the school, she expanded the curriculum that year to include more history, not just American history, but world history. The history of ideas, the concept that present events sink their roots deep into ancient soil. She had students who listened with that specific focus of young people who grasp that what they are learning bears a direct relationship to the world raging outside the window. After a particularly dense lesson regarding the causes of modern conflicts, she went to the store earlier than usual. It was a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, and leaned against the counter for a while without speaking about what was on her mind. Arthur let the silence breathe without attempting to fill it exactly the way he did things. After a while, she said there were days when the burden of trying to teach the future about the past, trying to help young minds comprehend the world while the world was behaving in a way that defied comprehension, felt vastly harder than she had anticipated when she chose to become a teacher. He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said he believed it was on exactly that kind of day that the work was most necessary. He said a ship caught in the middle of a storm needs its helmsman far more than it does when safely docked in port. He said this without solemnity. It was merely the observation of someone who had thought on the matter and was sharing the thought plainly. She looked at him for a second. Then she said that was a good way to look at it. He said it was the only way that made sense to him. She walked home that Wednesday with her thoughts slightly more organized than when she had arrived, and with the awareness, never new but constantly renewed, that there was exactly one person in the entire world with whom she needed only half an hour of conversation to put everything back in its proper place. The year 1945 ended with the close of the war, which arrived in Deep Creek via the radio on an August afternoon, with a collective relief recognized not by loud celebration, but by the way people simply breathed differently. There was a party in the square. There were conversations in the street that stretched late into the night. There was the profound sensation that the world had turned a massive page, and that what came next held at least the possibility of days unburdened by the specific weight of conflict. At the store, Arthur uncorked a bottle of wine he saved for occasions that warranted it, and poured a glass for everyone lingering around that late afternoon. When Eleanor arrived, there was a glass waiting on the counter. She hadn't been there when he poured for the others, but there was a glass waiting. She looked at the glass. She looked at him. He simply said it was a good afternoon for it. She agreed. They stood there, caught between the commotion in the square outside and the relative quiet inside the store, with the glass of wine and the smell of wood and coffee, and they didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed to be said that specific afternoon, because sometimes the world offers up a moment that is already entirely complete exactly as it is. The year 1947 brought a novelty that Deep Creek received, with the blend of enthusiasm and skepticism, small rural towns reserved for new things. A traveling cinema had begun visiting the region. A man named Silas drove a modified truck carrying a projector, a generator, a canvas screen, and a selection of reels he swapped out every season. He came to Deep Creek once a month, rigged the screen against the side of the butcher's barn, which Cornelius lent for the occasion, and showed 2 films a night for 3 nights. The whole town went to Silas's cinema. It was one of the only forms of collective entertainment available outside of town fairs and church services, and there was a festive air to it, even on weeknights when the show started at 7. Families dragging chairs from home, the youth sprawling on the grass. The smell of popcorn Silas's wife popped in a kettle out front and sold in paper bags. On a night in March 1947, Eleanor and Bea went to the pictures together. The film was an American romance in black and white, and Bea watched it with the absolute concentration of someone decoding a new language in real time. She read the actors' expressions slowly, missing nothing, with a determination Eleanor admired. The film was good. It featured a couple who discovered what lay between them far too late, or almost too late, after a long string of misunderstandings, hesitations, and choices governed by fear rather than courage, culminating in an ending that delivered that specific rush of relief. Good romances offer the viewer who bore the tension from the start. Bea watched the film in total silence. When the lights came back up and folks began to stand and chatter, she sat perfectly still for a moment, staring at the blank canvas screen. Then she said, without turning to Eleanor, in the voice of someone thinking out loud and not necessarily caring if anyone else heard, that it was a crying shame when folks in real life couldn't manage the same ending as the folks in the pictures. Eleanor said real life was more complicated. Bea said she agreed. That real life was certainly more complicated, but it wasn't all that different when it came to the fundamentals. She said that in certain stories, there comes a point where the complication ceases to be an excuse and simply becomes a habit. And that habit is the most insidious enemy of courage because it dresses itself up to look like prudence. She said this while staring at the empty white screen. Then she stood up, declared she was hungry, and mentioned she'd heard Mrs. Ellis was frying up hand pies that night. They walked off toward Mrs. Ellis's stall, and Bea never brought the subject up again. But there was something in what she said that lodged in Eleanor's mind for days. Not the film itself, but the concept of habit dressing itself up as prudence. She turned that image over in her head repeatedly that week, examining it from different angles as if holding an object with a strange geometry. She reached no conclusion that prompted her to act. But the image remained. The year 1949 brought Mr. Daniels's retirement, not in a dramatic fashion, but with the gentle grace of people who realize that the contribution they had to offer has been given, and it's time to clear the space for others. Over the years, he had trained 2 new teachers the state board had finally dispatched, and the Deep Creek School now boasted 3 classrooms and a small but genuine library. Lined with books that arrived through donation drives Eleanor had organized over the decades. At Daniels's farewell party, on a June afternoon with the weak winter sun filtering through the school windows, Eleanor spoke about what their decades of partnership had meant. She spoke with that honesty that was her trademark, lacking exaggerated praise, but refusing to diminish his worth. She stated that Daniels had been the kind of teacher that pedagogical theory rarely produces, but which practical reality demands, the kind who learns while he teaches, who possesses the humility to be a student to his own students. Daniels thanked her, his voice catching slightly, and said he had arrived in that town knowing very little of what he was doing and was leaving knowing vastly more, and that the difference in large part had been named Eleanor. After the party, during the clean-up that followed, Eleanor found, sitting on the corner of her desk, a sprig of rosemary tucked into a glass of water. She stopped. She stared at the sprig. It was rosemary, the exact same rosemary. The scent was unmistakable. It was cut to the exact length necessary to fit the glass. There was no note. There was no name. She held the glass in her hand for a moment. Then she walked to the schoolhouse window and looked out at the street. The street was perfectly normal. A few folks walking home from the party, a wagon rolling by, the general store visible on the corner with its side window propped open. On that Tuesday, when she arrived at the store, the usual mug of coffee sat on the counter. She stared at the counter for a second, then she said she had found Rosemary at the school. He was noting something in his ledger. He said, without lifting his eyes, that Mrs. Cecilia's garden was producing heavy this year, and that the neighbor had been walking around, giving it away to anyone who wanted it. She stood, looking at him for a moment. He lifted his eyes. There was something in his eyes in that exact instant. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't indifference, it was something right in the middle. The kind of look that appears when someone is actively deciding whether or not to step past what they have just said. Then he went back to the ledger. She picked up the mug of coffee and stayed there for a length of time that stretched longer than usual. When she left, there were 2 fresh sprigs of rosemary sitting on the edge of the counter, which she hadn't seen before and which were far too new to be an accident. She took both sprigs home. She put them in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill. They stayed there for weeks until they dried out, and then she pressed them inside one of the books on the shelf, right there on the exact same shelf as the Portuguese poem with the dog-eared page. The month of May in 1951 marked, by both of their calendars, the 29th anniversary of Eleanor's arrival in Deep Creek. She didn't mark the anniversary explicitly, she never had, but there was something about the end of April each year that arrived with a particular quality, like a note that time strikes once a year and which only she, and perhaps he, could pick out from among all the other notes. That May in 1951, on a Tuesday that began with a fine drizzle that later stopped, leaving the air with that distinct clarity of a freshly washed day, he had placed on the store counter, right next to the mug of coffee, a small Douglas fir sapling. Not a large fir, a sapling, a little pine barely a foot tall, in a terracotta pot, with firm green needles and that specific vigor of brand new things that don't yet comprehend how massive they're going to become. She looked at the sapling, then she looked at him. He said it was left over from the replanting Albert had done out by the edge of the road. He said he thought it might fit in the yard, seeing as the 3 big pines were casting a lot of shade, but there was still room over on the left side. She stood looking at the little fir sapling for a moment. She said yes, it would fit. She took the sapling home. She planted it on the left side of the yard, right where he had said there was room. She dug the hole with a trowel, placed the sapling gently inside, packed the dark soil around it with the palms of her hands, and watered it. She stood staring at the little pine in the yard for a long time. In the back, Prudence's 3 enormous firs were towering dense shadows against the May sky. And there, on the left side, a 12-inch sapling that had been left over from someone else's replanting, which was, depending on how you looked at it, a practical gesture regarding available yard space, or a very small, highly specific declaration that had chosen the shape of a Douglas fir to exist instead of words. She decided it was both things at the very same time. That some of the truest things in the world are those that manage to be both things at exactly the same time, without a shred of contradiction. The sapling grew slowly, the way Douglas firs grow, without rushing, possessing that consistency of things that require no urgency because they know exactly how large they are destined to be, and they understand that the time required to reach that size is part of the design, not an obstacle. In October 1952, when Eleanor opened her suitcase and began packing to leave, she had paused for a moment, staring out the bedroom window, where she could see the yard, Prudence's 3 great firs, and, on the left side, the new fir that had grown to perhaps 5 feet in 18 months, its first horizontal branches beginning to fan out, carrying that quality of decision found in young pines that lack the monumental weight of the adults, but already hold the shape, already show exactly what they are going to be. She looked at the little pine for a good long time before continuing to pack her bag. And when she unpacked that bag later and stayed in Deep Creek, the fur kept right on growing. It kept growing through the 2 following years, through the conversations and the revelations and the wedding and the years that came after. It kept growing with that dark green impassiveness that remains entirely unbothered by anything happening around it, because it holds inside itself an instruction far older and far simpler than any disturbance, the sheer instruction to grow.